Hey, folks! Happy Thursday. I am so glad that you are with us again. Yep, still not back in the normal studio, and are still very blessed to be having a continued conversation with Pastor Matthew Thomas, campus pastor in Deepwater, in Dartmouth, with Deepwater. Uh, Matthew, how are you? Again, it's been again super glad to have you with us.
Yeah, no, it's good. It's glad to be here. Glad to be with everybody again, with the great people of Stevens Road.
Awesome. So on Tuesday, we took kind of the 20,000 foot view. We just
Yeah,
talked a bit about racism, talked a little bit about some homework that I hope everybody was working on. Let's shrink us down a little bit. And the question that's been weighing on my heart for a little bit is there are times where I think the church has been really helpful in the long-term battle against racism.
mm,
There are times when it has not been helpful, um, and I think I hope I pray that the vast majority of us want to be better than that now. Um, how do we move beyond intentions? I mean, I tell people, hey, Jesus just asked us to love everybody, man. I
mm,
talk about that all the time, but I get the sense that there's a real risk of that being a platitude. Like when I
mm.
say that Jesus commands us to love like he loves, how do I love like he loves in a way that moves us to be anti-racist?
Yeah. That's a great question. Well, I think you just look at the definition of the word love, uh, especially God's love, the agape, in the Greek, which is very much an action word. It's a verb, and so I think just understanding God's love, that it's more than uh, just a phrase or an affirmation in our word, but it's also our deeds. It's how we act, how we treat one another. Jesus says, "How will they know you're my disciples? By the way you love one another." So there's the love of Christ. It's not only just love for a neighbor, but we actually when we step out and we tangibly do things that are loving, it actually affirms the love of God and brings glory to God. And so just understanding that as a truth, again, I think to step into this arena, you need to be filled with truth and understanding God and understanding who we are in Him, because that's what's going to fuel and give you the courage to come against challenging subjects or situations. So, the church, I would say, I think, again, the issue of racism and racial injustice is not, the church is not excluded from that. It's very much a part of, and that's because there's humans that exist that make up the church.
Yeah.
But I think what from a both as a follower of Jesus who's also African Nova Scotian, but also when I'm looking at the lens of some friends or even peers that I know who aren't followers of Christ, one of the criticisms I think that is fair is that there's an expectation of us to do justly, like we're commanded, and so we don't have the excuse that maybe an organization in government or a business, we can't excuse away our obligation to pursue racial reconciliation and pursue justice. And so I think that's the contrast to what we profess and then how we actually act, creates an indictment on us as believers. And I think we all have to wear that. And I think that is what both disturbs us as Black brothers and sisters with our white brothers and sisters, just the indifference and the silence often of when issues around racism happen. It just seems like everybody's quiet. But also more broadly to maybe to an unbelieving world, or to people who don't understand the church but only understand what we communicate to them, really see the church as irrelevant because of our unwillingness to speak to real social issues that are affecting people in our community. And then even just, I think theologically, when we talk about systemic racism, some of these ideas like white privilege and white superiority, which again, I don't have time to unpack all those things, but I encourage anybody listening to kind of just Google that, and there's all kinds of great books and resources, and just, you may or may not agree, but just to read it to get perspective. A lot of that thinking bleeds into our theology in terms of how we understand the church, how we understand God. And I think even in our academy, even in school, like there's a whole tradition of early African Christianity that if you would barely get a lot of info on if you did church history in a seminary.
Yeah.
And so again, it's one of those things where, like every arena in education or other aspects of society, it seems as though African people have not contributed significantly to whatever it is we're doing, in this context, the church. And therefore, again, we minimize, or we have a narrow Eurocentric lens by which we see God, we see the church, and then that comes down right to our practices when an issue of racial injustice happens. And so I would say for me, that's where I get challenged the most is there's a dominant Eurocentric theological perspective in how theology is taught, the different theological perspectives that are included in the conversation. And then, and unfortunately, not intentionally, but a byproduct of that is it reinforces this superior Eurocentric theological viewpoint as the viewpoint, rather than just another perspective of many within the theological discourse. And that's where I get challenged, and that might be something that we don't even think of as the church, that these same societal issues, systemic issues, the superiority complex, privilege still filters in even to the way we do church. Tribalism, and again, I think tribalism happens on both sides, but I think it's easy for people who are different to speak to their tribalism, that they're just worried with their ethnic group and not necessarily submitted to the full authority of Christ as Lord. Yeah. But I think white people miss that a lot of times what they're holding on to is their Eurocentric tribalism, and they haven't submitted fully to the lordship of Christ with that. And I think that's something that is often missed with the majority church.
That's such a good point, because I know when I look at church history, I mean, even when I imagine, as I'm reading, biblical passages, and as I'm imagining the apostles and Christ, I have to work hard to remember that they did not grow up in England. Like they're not. No. Yeah, they're not. Like they're not that we're talking about people who were from the Middle East or from Syria. They're from places in Africa. Yeah. And I can't tell you how many pictures of the apostles or Jesus or the church fathers that they look an awful lot like me, and they probably did not.
No. Yeah. Well, I think the symbol of the white Jesus has been really harmful to Black identity, because it presupposes that whiteness has value. And or even for a Black person, that even in our own consciousness, or even in our own kind of wrestle with understanding ourselves and feeling dehumanized, that whiteness is how we'll be valued, and therefore we devalue the color of our own skin. And so again, there's so many subtle things that reinforce the dehumanization of Black skin. And so the symbol of, again, I could even just talking about white Jesus in some of our pictures and different things in our buildings could be a sensitive subject and cause a lot of tension. But those are things that are just relics. They're not gospel. They're idols. And I think sometimes they're unhelpful to more of the mosaic and the all nations and tribes picture we get in Revelations of what it really means to be part of the kingdom. And I just don't think it's accurate. Like, Jesus wasn't white.
Yeah.
He looked more like me than he did you, Chris. Sorry, you know what I mean. And an Afro-Asiatic, and also the Middle East is closer to Africa than it is the Americas, and so the thinking would be a lot different. And even again, we do disservice to even biblical interpretation when we apply this Eurocentric lens, and even not just Eurocentric, but even just our modern lenses to ancient texts. It's just you miss a lot of the truth in it, and then also you can misrepresent it to fit your own preconceived notions or perspective that end up reinforcing against some of these systemic issues, this superiority or this privilege kind of an entitlement attitude that sometimes can be pervasive, can end up being reinforced even just by the way we read the Bible. Yeah. I mean, and when I say read it wrongly. Yeah.
All right. Let me ask you a question. Let's assume that you've made converts out of all of us, and I want to be a good brother to you. I want to be a good ally to other Black Maritimers and just people all around the world.
Yeah.
How do I do that without being counterproductive? Because I hear the terms tossed around a lot of, we don't need white tears. Kind of that educate yourself. Like, please don't start calling, texting, messaging your the handful of Black people and inundating them with questions. I know obviously I did that to you. I'm doing that to you literally right now. What makes us what would help make us a good brother and sister in Christ, or a good ally to those outside of our faith?
For sure. So let me just kind of speak into a Christian context for a moment.
Please.
I actually think it's very powerful and timely to have, for example, myself or someone from the Black community speak about these things, because you're sharing your platform and your influence. And a lot of times that's, again, those systemic barriers are such where Black people aren't given a platform to and really it's empowering a voice. Sometimes we minimize voices because we only allow them to exist on certain platforms or certain levels. And so for you to invite me says that this is important. It speaks to the congregation. It has a lot of implications. It says this is important. I want to speak accurately. And again, we don't have to reserve these types of spaces just for African Heritage Month, or when there's a crisis, a racial revolution. Like, Black people have a lot of good things to add that edify the body of Christ any time of the year. And so I think just sharing your platform and seeing that our contributions edify everyone, not just around racial issues, but again, same time too, being willing to share your platform, share your ability to influence others with those credible voices, I think is very important. One thing I will say, this is just really practical. This is a pet peeve of mine, just a myth. A lot of times I hear well-intentioned, mostly white people they'll say this: I don't see color.
Yeah.
Now, I get the notion. I get what you're trying to say. And there was a time where that was actually, to some degree, politically correct.
Yeah.
But it is not anymore. And it is offensive. And it's just, so I would just say, just take that out of your vocabulary. Just something really practical, because if God made us with distinction, He's given us ethnicities, why wouldn't we want to see that? To not see color is not to see the person fully. It's just like saying, we don't see the distinction of color in the universe. Like, we don't see blue skies and green trees, or the forest, like in autumn, during autumn or fall, when we see the trees a different color. Yeah. I don't see color when I'm referring to the tree. That doesn't even make sense.
Yeah.
Because I want to be inclusive or fair to the trees. But again, I hope I'm being a little facetious, but you get the logic in that.
I get it. I mean, it's, it'd be like saying I don't see height, or I don't see
Yes.
body shape, and
Yes.
I do, and the fact that those distinctions matter, that
Yeah.
that your height, your body shape, and your color influence how you move around in the world. And
That's right.
if we pretend that we don't see it, then we can't address moments where things aren't working the way they're supposed to.
Yeah. And I just don't think you can make that statement and uphold it fully in our world. Something will be presented where, if it's media or just perception or even some of these systemic issues that I said before, where we'll very much see color. That color blindness is never going to be 100%. I'm just saying, even if we wanted to adhere to that way of thinking, I don't even think it's plausible that we could actually fully affirm that all the time. And that's besides the point. I just think fundamentally, I want you to see that I'm biracial, that I'm lighter complected. Like, that's who I am. That's how it's the lens by which I see myself. And so to not honor that is an unintentional devaluing of me or anybody who's a person of color. To your point, who might have other distinctions in which represents who they are. So that's one thing. That's just a pet peeve. I just want to just like kibosh that notion, because it's offensive. It does not help the narrative. It does not help the discussion when I see posts. And it would be similar when people talk about Black Lives Matter. Oh, but all lives matter. Okay.
Yeah.
Again, there's this unwillingness to understand the point of why that's being said. And I heard a comedian say this is what Black people are asking just for their lives to matter. Like, can we just matter? It's not like we're asking Black lives are superior, or like we just want to, like, that's like how low the bar is.
Yeah, matter be like a low bar. Yeah.
Yeah, that's like a low. We can't even have a low bar. Like, we're not asking even for a high one. We just want to matter. Yeah. And this still push the, or when you talk about, again, we always make false dichotomies. To have Black lives matter must mean that all lives don't matter, or that if I talk about racial injustice and police brutality, that I'm anti-police. Like, we need to get rid of these false dichotomies, because it's just they're insensitive, they're disruptive, and they prevent us from dealing with the real issues at hand. It's just an easy way of isolating myself from the real griminess and dirt of getting involved and really wrestling through this conversation, even if you agree or you disagree. But I think just having that willingness to engage and to just take off simplistic notions, trying to understand a very complex dynamic. Yeah. That's another thing I would say. Engage with the issues. Don't just use simple, catchwords to try to diffuse or try to create this summary of what the issue is and minimize and use these simplistic rationales. It's just, I don't think that's helpful, and I think we can do better than that. And it's not a false dichotomy. You can be both and not everything's either or. Some things are gray. You can move around from side to side a little bit. So I think that is having that perspective around these issues. Again, I think as people, we want clear answers. We want to be able to compartmentalize and distinguish and try to make sense of our world. And so it's easy to do it with these simple definitions or categories. And I just think we have to challenge that, because if not, you're not going to fit people into those boxes. You have to redefine how you understand these realities. So those are a couple things I would say on how to be an effective ally. Also, one thing I would say that may be a little different perspective is the onus is not just on, and this would be a Christian, definitely a Christian ethic, but I think just in generally speaking, the onus is not just on Black people to solve the issue of racism.
Right.
We all have a responsibility, especially those of us in the church, and also sometimes recognize too, as Black people, although you want to reach out to us, or you want to learn, or maybe you want to just be empathetic, which I think is awesome, and I encourage that, but also recognize that at times as Black people, it's overwhelming. That we feel like sometimes we have to represent our entire race and try to give you solutions to, century-long problems that we're actually experiencing trauma at the same time trying to answer your question. And I'm tired. I'll speak for myself. I've found the last couple of weeks extremely exhausting. And again, I honor that people want to help. They want to be a part of the solution. They want to do what they feel is right. They want to go to credible sources where they can get information from people that they're in a relationship with, they trust, that may be people of color. So I get the intention. I think is good, and I honor that. But also just be mindful, just be aware that as you're asking a Black person, there's a good chance that as they're trying to answer your question or be graceful to you, it's also adding, I wouldn't say more stress, but it's work for us to just try to navigate our own trauma, we're provoked by all this hurt. And a lot of us have our own incidents of being, experiencing racism, and all, like these instances trigger all that. So it's all rushing to the fore. And also we're overwhelmed and we don't have the answer. And so just understand that, like, we might not be at a place where there's concrete solutions. I don't think we are. We still haven't fully diagnosed the problem. Mm-hmm. And I think we're closer than we've ever been, at least in my lifetime right now. I think this latest incident and what's happening in our world is definitely moving the conversation forward where we have more understanding. So I think that is a great thing, but we're still diagnosing the problem. And I don't believe in giving prescriptions before a diagnosis. I think that's just malpractice. And so be patient that, there might not be definitive things that can be done. And also, again, I would always say, as I said earlier, feel free to educate, to read, to inform yourself, Google some stuff. I would start with just understanding white supremacy, privilege. I would also, another good subject is white fragility. These are all great subject matters to understand systemic racism and some of the things that could even be triggered in you. And also understand too, as a Black person, as myself, I have my own kind of soul searching that I have to do, because I realize even through this that I have resentment towards white people. I do. And again, I have, as a follower of Christ as well, an obligation to search my heart, because I have to repent of that, because that's not helpful. Even though I think part of grieving is to kind of experience that righteous anger and kind of let some of that stuff pass through, but to hold on to that, harbor that, and to now see all white people in a negative light that's not the gospel either. And that's something that even myself, that this latest episode of racial injustice has revealed in me, that I've harbored a lot of bitterness that I've had through experiences of racism that I encountered in my own life that God is bringing to my mind. And so again, I submit everything under the lordship of Christ, including my ethnicity. And so I need to wrestle with that. And so again, Black people are also wrestling with their own bitterness and resentment and hurt and anger. And that's why sometimes when we loot or our protests aren't peaceful, or we seem angry because we're in pain, like we're traumatized. Like how do you expect a person who's traumatized and in pain to act, proper or whatever, expectation of decency we think someone should have? I'm not saying that we shouldn't be respectful and we shouldn't handle ourselves accordingly, but again, we have all experienced pain and know that when we're in that state of being, we're not at our best and we're hurt. And so just have that understanding that is a lot of what Black people are processing. And so again, I don't have the solutions. I don't. And again, sometimes this is where it feels overwhelming for me, where people are looking for them and even feeling like impatient or tired of just the same kind of response. But yeah, I think just having the awareness, being educated, being sensitive, and even just, again, some of the things I said practically around color blindness. Those are just some things I would say as people wanting to be allies within the church and outside, just tangible things that they can kind of think through.
It's good, man. I've got one last question for you. Then I'm going to let you get back to enjoying a day, I guess, or
yes,
the good work you got today. It's this. I want you to imagine, I don't know, maybe it's August, it's September, and the demonstrations, the marches, the hashtags, the changing your profile picture, like all of that stuff. It accomplished something. It really did move the needle forward. It worked to some extent. And you go out for a walk some August day, some September day, and things are different. What do you notice first?
What I will notice first is actually if some of those comments, hashtags, posts, if they're still happening. That's my biggest thing that I'm concerned about with this latest movement is I'm curious if we're just not captured by emotion and are just in the moment, which again, I think with any moral panic or we're disrupted, we're going to react immediately. But once kind of the dust clears and there's some normalcy and, COVID's over in terms of people going back to some form of regular life, and these issues are no longer front of mind, what will the response be? So if I still see the response relatively strong like it is now, or at least it's still communicating the needle being pushed forward, that would be a huge indication, let's say in August, that something has changed and something is different. From the church's perspective, if we see that justice is a part of our discipleship, or maybe even changes the way we do discipleship, so we don't just focus on justification, just the kind of the individual being redeemed or salvation as just me as an individual forgiven, but also what does it mean to uphold God's justice? So that maybe we do some kind of ministry that we never did, or maybe we do a sermon series that that's propelling a whole new strategy for discipleship that's very much justice focused. And again, it's not only the sanctification as an individual, but what is our responsibility that our world, our society is sanctified. So if I was seeing like shifts even in how we do discipleship, maybe just coming across different brothers and sisters and what they're doing, that would be from the church's perspective, would be a huge indication that the needle has shifted for me. I would say the biggest thing I would love to see, and this is probably more further down the road than August, but to see Black people actually be owners and have more equity, and there be more representation in organizations, not tokenism, but like actual, like we value diversity as an organization. So you see that reflected in church organizations and business and government, and not just, again, this entry level representation, but all through an organization. If a Black person, if anybody's qualified, let's not put limitations on what people can do or can't do based on how they look. Let us get good people and also value diversity. Because again, when you have a diverse space, even though diversity is harder, I'll be honest with you, because people are different. And sometimes when we have difference, it takes more work to get to agreement. But when we get to agreement, we will have covered much larger of a landscape because of those different voices are at the table. Versus when you have things that are homogeneous, yes, it's easier, but it's limited because it's just kind of one perspective. So seeing kind of diversity reflected in organizations, and then when I said ownership, like I'm from East Preston, an historic African Nova Scotia community, and we don't have any economy. We don't have a store. We don't have a grocery store. We don't own anything. We think we own our houses, but even that's questionable because a lot of the government still owns land deeds.
Yeah.
So I like to see us like own things, and not only just for ourselves, but how our community, all of our community, all Nova Scotia could benefit from our economy and our business, just like every other community does. I would love. That's actually a prayer that I have, that we would see. Just Black ownership and Black economics. Again, that not only benefits the Black community, but again, it becomes a way that the Black community is blessing the broader community. And then finally, I would say I would love to see African history taught, not just during February, but when the school year starts back up, whenever that is, there's more of a need to teach that history, because I think that knowing that history would do well to combat the next generation of carrying on similar attitudes of bigotry or ignorance. And also not only just history, but how do you, I would love to see kids learning how to combat, just like they combat bullying. How do you combat racism? Yeah. What do you do? And just try to even teach our kids educationally how to be anti-racist. And so that can help support families at home of raising a generation that just has that anti-racist conviction, and they continue to lead what justice and reconciliation will look like as the next generation is kind of leading the way. So those are, again, probably more than just what would happen in August. I would say realistically for me, for August, it would be still seeing a stream or a momentum of people still engaged in this issue and not everybody going back to life as normal.
That's great. Man, I appreciate how much time you've given, how open you've been, and just pouring your heart and soul into the conversation. Thanks so much for your time.
No problem. It's my pleasure. Happy to share, happy to fellowship with my brothers and sisters in Christ. And again, we're all part of God's family, so we're all after the same thing, even though we bring different perspectives to the table. So I'm glad just to offer my perspective that will hopefully make us all more like Christ and accomplish his mission and will for his church and as believers.
That's great. All right, folks, that's us for today. Stay safe. God bless. We'll see you on Sunday for Digital Church.